Okay, well, welcome. It's great to see everybody again, and today we have a special tour of our newest garden, which is the Watershed Garden. And let me just get to the slides here. All right, now does anybody remember when the Watershed Garden was first installed? Please, somebody that knows. Wasn't it just like last fall?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it was finished in January. It was unleashed in January. We had a big,
Unveiling.
unveiled.
Yeah, and look at it now. This is a picture that I took last week. It is certainly one of the most delightful of the garden areas. And one thing I've noticed in my travels, in my researches and my walks through the garden, is that there's almost always something in bloom. For people who are going to be walking through the garden using the slides as a way to identify the plants, I have a little map here, and I noticed when I was trying to put this in here that because this was all a grassy area previously, it's not actually even on the map. This is the native plant garden, and this sort of is the edge of the Watershed Garden. But this will allow people to get oriented so that they know what's going on. So one of the first things I wanted to begin with is to talk about what watersheds are, and I know Mary sent out a really nice explanation of that, but also talk really quickly about the water cycle and why this is important. And so if we start with the water storage in the oceans, through the heat of the sun, there's evaporation, and that's one way that water gets into the atmosphere. There's freshwater storage and evaporation from that. And then evapotranspiration, which is just water that is being evaporated from the ground, from moist ground into the atmosphere. Water is stored in the atmosphere and then comes back down as precipitation, either snow or rain or ice or sleet or whatever. That gets warmed again, and we have a snow melt runoff into the streams. The stream flows into freshwater storage or through groundwater through infiltration, and eventually makes its way via rivers to the back to the ocean. So that's the hydrologic cycle, and that's one of the things that's really important in understanding what a watershed garden is. So who wants to tell me what a watershed garden is and what you think it is?
All right, I'm going to call on people. Tonia, what do you think a watershed garden is?
Yes, that is
What?
a garden that can you hear me?
Yep.
That acts like a watershed, so it collects water to one place. The water goes into the garden, not outside. That's like the garden identifies the watershed.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's a garden in which the water is not channeled away from the soil and into the street in an urban area and into the drains, but it's a garden in which the water is collected and stored. So what do you think the elements of a watershed garden are going to be? And we'll just stay with Tonia since you're on the screen.
Tony, you have to be close to your speaker. Okay.
How about now? Is better?
Yeah.
So a watershed has some ridges, I mean, the higher elevation that kind of makes the water go in. So I think, so it has to have some borders so the water doesn't spill out, so it goes in. And it has to have some material that lets the water go down and not outside again.
Right.
The two elements.
And that's a good point that we'll get to in just a second about there being barriers. So one of the resources that I was using, and by the way, I will have a list of URLs and resources at the end of this if you want to do further study. They use the acronym OWL, Oxygen, Water, and Life, for healthy soil. Healthy soil acts like a sponge. And if the soil is healthy, it will soak up tremendous amounts of water. There are 4 main components or elements of a watershed garden. The other 3 are climate appropriate plants, rainwater, of course, and then efficient irrigation to supplement the rainwater. So we're going to look at all of those elements real quickly. But first of all, it's real important to understand that in a conventional landscape that we've got around here, we have impermeable surfaces like concrete. We have compacted soil. In our case, we have clay soil, which doesn't absorb water very well at all. And the water runs right off the property. In a watershed-wise landscape, the water stays on the property. You have permeable paving. You have berms, as Tanya suggested, that help to collect the water, and it soaks into the living soil, which is a soil with a high carbon content, and replenishes the aquifer. And I wanted to give a special shout out to the Green Gardens group, which is based down in LA. They had some really excellent graphics, and I got their permission to use the graphics in this presentation. So let's go through those 4 components. Living soil. Living soil is soil that has a lot of carbon in it. And that's one of the things that our mineral clay soil really lacks. It is alive, it's got healthy microbes in it. And the way to make living soil from the mineral soil that we have is to put a lot of compost or worm castings into the soil and to mulch it very heavily. In our area, they recommend at least 2 inches and maybe even 4 inches of mixed leaf and wood mulch. And also it's a good idea not to rake the leaves, fallen leaves off of the soil. Before I go on, are there any questions about that or comments about that? Okay. Now here's where a missed opportunity, because I used their graphics of them harvesting rainwater when I should have gone over to Gamble and taken pictures of the rain barrels, and I realized that late this afternoon when I ran out of time. But harvesting rainwater, every 1,000 square feet of roof will give you 620 gallons of water for an inch of rain. And in our climate, where we get an average of around 15 to 17 inches of rain a year, that's a huge amount of water. Now, the soil can store much more water than any of these cisterns, but barrels are good for slowing down the speed at which the water is coming off the roof and allowing it to soak into the soil.
Can I ask a question at this juncture, Doug?
Absolutely.
Of the group, if everyone can think of one thing that they already have an idea of that they could do at home based on what you've just heard from Doug. What's one thing that you think you could do?
Mulching or doing something like mulching?
Mulching?
Yeah.
Mulching is one. What's another one?
Get rid of concrete surfaces.
Right.
And replace them.
Right. What's another one? Look at the picture.
Get a rain barrel.
Get a rain barrel.
That's right.
And then for me, I know that when we run our sprinkler, a lot of it runs into the street. So I need those berms. I need to keep the water going into the ground and not running off into the storm drains and carrying all kinds of pollutants with it.
Yeah, the Green Gardens group says no flat yards, which is kind of hard in our area, but it's something I hadn't thought about. The next component is climate appropriate plants. And I think this is a great graphic because look at this. Annual plant water requirements in inches, 55 inches of water a year for grass, as opposed to maybe 5 inches a year for Epilobium, which is the fuchsia, and we'll see that in just a second. That's a huge, huge difference. And it means that what you want, the best plants to plant are native plants that have evolved with the soils and the climate and the birds and the insects of the place. And the good thing about native plants is that they will attract native wildlife to the garden. So you get your butterflies and you'll get your hummingbirds, and as long as you put local plants in the landscape. And the last is a screenshot from my computer. I just installed an intelligent irrigation system about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And this thing is really something. So it is connected to the internet, and it gets a weather report from NOAA. And it knows whether or not there's going to be any precipitation. Of course, we're not going to see any precipitation in the summer here. And it also knows the temperatures, the maximum and minimum temperatures for the day, and calculates evapotranspiration, or the loss of water from the soils. And you can see here, on July 19th, I was scheduled to run it for 50 minutes, but it only ran for 39 minutes. And on July 17th, it was scheduled to run for 50 minutes, but only ran for 42 minutes. So it does a calculation of how dry it thinks the soil is going to be, and only puts enough water on to put the appropriate amount of water in the soil. And it'll tell me how many gallons of water it has saved. So these are really interesting intelligent irrigation systems, and are a major component of putting in a watershed garden. Any questions about that? All right, well, let's begin our tour of the garden. So here's a plant that we've seen several times in many other places in the garden, and is one of my favorites. It's the California native Mimulus, the sticky monkey flower, which has just recently been reclassified to a new genus called Diplocus, and God knows why. But the nice thing about the monkey flower is look at the range of flowers. This guy is called Snow Angel. This one is Jelly Bean Dark Pink. This is sort of the standard native plant that you'll see out at the Baylands or up in the hills here. And I don't recall getting the name for this. This is one of my favorite plants. It's a host.
I think that one's bronze.
Bronze.
I originally
Right.
got that one from Western Hills up in Occidental.
You're right. I remember the name. I remember the name now. This will grow in many kinds of climates, wet, dry, sandy, rocky. It is a host plant for a lot of butterflies, and it's got a phenolic resin which helps the plant retain its water. It's got a very distinctive feel, and it is kind of sticky, even though it doesn't look anything like a monkey. Any questions about that? All right, let's go to our next plant. This is another one of my favorites. And by the way, I think one of the things you'll notice as we go through these is that a watershed garden, even in a dry climate like ours, does not have to be boring. There are just some absolutely amazing plantings and plants that add just a huge amount of color. Epilobium is another one of my favorites because I see it in hikes up in the hills here all the time. The one that we saw in the California native garden was that beautiful sort of crimson color. And this one I had not seen before until it bloomed in our garden, Marin pink. Let's see if there's anything I want to say. Oh, so it's native to California. It's a perennial plant, and just seems to bloom most of the summer long, as I remember. Anybody have questions about this or comments?
I would just comment that it looks like one that pollinators would be very fond of.
Yes, what kind of pollinators?
Maybe ones that can either crawl deep in or have a long beak, maybe like a hummingbird.
That's right. That's right. And it's a little bit low. I think the hummingbirds are a little bit nervous, but there's so much nectar in these flowers that it's a good place to stake out if you want to either take pictures or see hummingbirds. So most of the pictures, in fact, all except this next one, are pictures that I took in the last 2 weeks. But this one, I was fortunate enough to get in the spring. This is a California lily, Pacific Coast iris, sorry, Pacific Coast iris. And the floor of the Watershed Garden was just absolutely covered with these in the early part of the spring. It was really, really spectacular. Unfortunately, like most of these irises, the flowers last, a couple of days at the most. They will bloom sequentially, but once that bloom is over, it's over and you don't see anything else. But I think this is a really interesting and beautiful lily. One of the cultivation notes that I read about it is that they don't like to have their roots disturbed. So it can be difficult to cultivate, but it will grow from seed. And if you can grow it from seed, just sow it somewhere, then you won't have to dig it up and transplant it. Are there any comments or questions about that?
When you said,
Not that bad to divide. I've done it lots of times.
Is that right, Cheryl? Okay.
when you said the floor was covered, is it not very tall?
Good question. It is only about, I don't know, 4 to 6 inches tall. Cheryl, would you say?
Yeah, it's definitely wider than it is tall. And a cluster is probably 2 feet, can spread up to 3, but usually you end up at that point with kind of a ring of leaves and a bare spot in the middle.
Right, right. Anyway, really pretty for a short amount of time. And next spring, I hope to get some more pictures. We have a couple of different varieties, and it's really quite a striking plant. Here's another one. Oops. Hookura. Another really nice, interesting plant. I think Cheryl introduced us to the concept of a see-through plant, the see-through grasses last week when we looked at the perennial border. And Hookura is also another kind of nice see-through. I like the challenge in colors between the deep dark green and the brilliant coral color. And I believe this also comes in quite a variety of different shades. And I learned also that for the Navajo, one species was considered a panacea and a pain reliever. Any other comments about that?
Well, I would recommend that everybody take a close look at the photo on the left and notice it from a garden design kind of perspective, because look at the shapes and textures and the farther distant grass, the variegated grass there, the shapes of the Hookura's leaves. That's just a stunning little segment of our garden, and you captured it perfectly, Doug.
Well, thanks. We have various plantings of this all around the garden. Can people please put their microphones on mute when you're not talking? Thank you. Okay, so here's our next plant. And let's see if I get this pronunciation correct. Nepofia. Is that right, Cheryl? You have to take your... Sorry.
Usually Nepofia.
Nepofia. Okay. Nepofia.
Yeah, and there is some, if you one of my favorite websites for learning about plants is the San Marcos Growers wholesale nursery. They always have a description of how different names should be pronounced. This is one of the ones, along with Hookura, where if you were to base it purely on how the original person that it was named after pronounced his name, it would be something like Nepofia. I don't know German, but something very German.
Right.
And we don't do that.
So these are really striking plants. I'm sure everybody has seen, well, they call it the red hot poker or the poker plant or the torch lily. Everybody has seen the red and yellow and orange ones that are in the perennial beds. I think I am glad that the garden designers chose this one, which is not quite as showy as the red variety, because your eye just immediately goes to it. The other thing that I'm just amazed at, it is really interesting to look at the shape and the orientation of these flowers as they mature. And you can see they kind of, here they're sort of spread out laterally, and they begin to point downwards until when the flower bud actually opens, they're pointing almost straight down, which is certainly going to make it a challenge for those hummingbirds and other pollinators to get in there. Hummingbirds and orioles, the notes say, are the primary pollinators of these guys.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is this a non-California native? This comes from probably some other part of the world.
South Africa.
South Africa.
Yes, right, South Africa.
So I
right.
think it's interesting that in the Watershed Garden, it's different from our native plant garden, our native California garden. They're both watershed gardens. Probably technically you could say the native plant garden is a watershed garden. But in a watershed garden, you want climate appropriate plants, and that doesn't restrict you to California natives necessarily.
Right, right. And in fact, we have another example of a Mediterranean plant here, the Euphorbia. These are, I think these subspecies, the two main subspecies that we have in the garden here are from the Mediterranean, from southern France to Anatolia. And this is a plant that's also used, has uses in traditional medicine. As we mentioned last week, all these Euphorbias have this white sicky sap that was used to treat skin problems like cancers and tumors and warts since ancient times. A very, very unusual flower. Anything else on these guys? So one of the things I wanted to show you is that I have gone through, when we turn these into a self-guided tour or a plant identification, for all the plant names, I've linked them to the Wikipedia entries so that you could just click on that if you're on your phone and you're in the garden and you want to know more about the plant and the identification or its use, you can just click on that. All right, what do we have next? Oh, this is the one that foiled me. Because when I first saw this, I thought that it was a Salvia. But if you look at the flower really carefully, it doesn't have, and I'll show you a Salvia, I think, in the next, it doesn't have the typical Salvia kind of flower. And Cheryl correctly pointed me in the correct direction and said that this is Stachys bullata, the California hedge nettle. This is something that you will see in just about every forest, any woodland walk that you go on in our area around here. It is definitely a native, or it's escaped, and you'll find it everywhere. It's endemic to California, and it's found in the coastal ranges and the transverse ranges and other in central parts of the state. A really pretty little, I mean, it's a tiny little flower. This plant is probably, I don't know, maybe 12 to 14 inches tall here. So you can see how small the flowers are. But it's really pretty when you see it on the roadside or on the side of the path. And does anybody have anything they want to add to that? Okay. Salvias. Salvias are another one of my favorites just because of the absolute variety, the number of different shapes and sizes and the colors of plants that we can find. It's the largest genus of plants in the mint family. There's 1,000 different species, and they grow as shrubs, perennials, and annuals. It's distributed throughout the Old World and the Americas. So Mary had asked a question or had made an observation, what do we do when somebody asks us a question we can't answer? And somebody, when I was doing one of the tours, said, well, what does salvia mean? And I thought, and I thought, and I thought, and I could not figure it out. So I went back and found out that salvia derives from the Latin salvare, which means to feel well and healthy, or to heal. And it's related to the word salus, health or well-being. And that's because the plants were thought to, especially a Salvia officinalis, the culinary smell, was thought to have all kinds of healing properties. Now, one of the things that I learned in doing my research on this is that they have a really unusual pollination mechanism. They have a stamen, and for the most part, a bee will climb inside to try and get to the nectar, which is at the back of the flower. And the stamen will deposit the pollen, or a little pollen bag, on the back of the pollinator. And that is when the plant is in its male stage. In order to avoid self-pollination, it goes through a male stage where it produces pollen, and in a female stage where it will accept pollen. For the plants in the female stage, when the pollinator, the bee, or in this case, climbs back in, it deposits the pollen onto the stigma, which is also right up there at the top. And I don't know that there are many other plants that have that kind of specialization. And it's also interesting that this lever, there actually is a lever mechanism when the pollinator steps on the base of the petal here. This thing kind of comes down and onto the back of the animal that's entering. Kind of really interesting. It's not specialized for a single pollinator, it's generic. We know that there are some plant and pollinator pairs which are highly specialized. In this case, apparently it's a generic pollination mechanism. I thought that was interesting. Anybody have anything to add?
I just want to point out that these two bees are not actually using that mechanism. They are stealing nectar. They're poking a hole in the base of the flower and sipping the nectar out of that.
And I was going to mention that same thing. So Doug, did you actually capture these two?
Yes, these are my photographs.
Oh.
And I hung around for a while, when this was actually going to crawl in, because it's really obvious. If I could enlarge this, it's really obvious that, yeah, this guy is putting a hole in, and he's stealing the nectar without getting pollen.
Yeah. So it's cool that you caught both of these bees in the act of stealing.
Right.
So Cheryl, what happens if they steal the nectar? How do they get pollinated? Anyone know? Or maybe Alex knows.
No.
Well, I
Sorry,
guess.
can you repeat the question, please?
Oh yeah, Alex. When a bee is stealing the nectar like this by coming in from the outside and drilling a hole down at the base, how does the flower get pollinated?
I mean, ideally, there are other pollinators that don't steal. Not as well. I don't necessarily have an answer.
Yeah, that's one for us to maybe think on a bit. John, is your mic on?
I don't think so.
Okay, somebody's mic is on.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there obviously are going to be some bees that aren't thieves. some pollinators that aren't thieves that are going to go in and play ball, do things correctly. But I thought it was interesting that in the space of just a few minutes, I captured these two thieves. Okay, here's another really cool plant. Arbutus Unido, the strawberry tree. This was actually, I thought this was sort of interesting. It was one of the many species that Carl Linnaeus identified in volume 1 of his landmark work on naming species. And the name Unido is attributed to Pliny the Elder, who allegedly claimed that unum tantum edo, meaning I eat only one, because this fruit is actually edible. But nobody knows whether he meant that the fruit was so good he could eat only one, or whether he meant that the fruit was uninteresting, so he ate only one. It's native to the Mediterranean region, and the leaves have been employed in traditional and folk medicine with astringent, diuretic, antiseptic, intoxicant, tonic, and all kinds of other properties. I was also interested to see that the fruit is used for jam and marmalades and yogurt, and also alcoholic beverages. The Portuguese Mendronho is a type of strong brandy. Has anybody ever tasted the fruit of the arbutus?
Yes, I have.
And how would you describe it?
When it's really, really ripe, it's pretty good. If it's not completely ripe, it's a little bit, what's the taste? It's kind of stuck to your tongue kind of thing.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah,
the notes here said that the flowers are pollinated by bees. I don't have any pictures of the flowers.
I think it's by, because I have one in the front yard, and lots of hummingbirds, like in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it says that if the bees collect the honey, that the honey is bitter tasting, but it's still considered a delicacy.
I think it also has many seeds, Linda, right? The fruit has many little tiny seeds.
Yes.
It's not easy to eat.
No, I just ate the whole thing.
No, you eat the whole thing, but it just has many things, like a raspberry kind of thing, little tiny seeds that you eat them. Or, yeah.
Have you eaten them also, Tonia?
Yes, in Greece we eat them when they ripen. They ripen in the fall, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, we go out and collect them. I don't particularly like the taste.
Yeah, it's not like very sweet, but when it's really, really ripe, sometimes you can, when it's really, really red or orangey and it's soft, it's pretty good. Yeah, when you pick directly from the tree.
Our landscape designer told me that this is related to the madrone, the California madrone. I don't know if anybody who's knowledgeable knows if that's correct, but if you look at the stem, yes, Cheryl?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you look at the stem there on the right, you can see that madrone-like stem with the reddish bark peeling to show the green underneath. So it is a very beautiful plant.
Madrone is Arbutus menziesii, and unfortunately, it is very difficult to grow in a garden, but it is beautiful.
It's really, I'm sure everybody has seen this plant. It is popular in neighborhood gardens around here. And these things sure do look like strawberries when they're hanging off the tree. And of course, they're not related to strawberries at all. So here's another plant. So one of the things you'll notice is that I was focusing on, in the past, we've been focusing on the plants that are in flower. And I've given short shrift to the trees and the bushes and the shrubbier things, and certainly the grasses. But I decided that we should really go and take a look at some of these things, even though they're not, some of them may not be in bloom or in fruit right now. And I was really surprised to find this guy because I've seen this plant all over the place on hikes. Frangula californica, which is a California coffee berry. I didn't know what it was. It's also called a buckthorn, California coffee berry or buckthorn. The fruits are edible and the seeds are edible. And I learned that the seeds inside the berries actually look like coffee beans, and they make an excellent caffeine-free coffee substitute, superior to chicory, it says here, and with overtones of mocha. Now, has anybody ever had coffee made from the coffee berry? Well, our plant is not in bloom. I got this picture off the web because it doesn't have berries yet. I think it's too young. But you can certainly see this plant whenever you go out hiking in the woodlands here. The berries are also edible, and they apparently are made into jams and jellies. And again, Native Americans had a lot of medicinal uses for this plant. And I was interested to learn that the Ohlone used to use the leaves to treat poison oak dermatitis. And I don't know how, in what kind of preparation they would do that. But this grows actually fairly tall, at least the ones that I have seen in the wild. Oh, geez, they can be like 10 feet tall, Cheryl, maybe 15, 12 feet tall. Yeah. Okay.
I think this variety is chosen to be smaller, but yes.
And here's another one of my favorites. It's just such a beautiful magenta flower. We've seen it in other parts of Gamble Garden. And they just renamed it. As soon as I learned the name Calandrinia, they renamed it to Sistanthia. And I do actually believe that taxonomists get paid every time they rename a plant because they do so often. They're a succulent plant. They have a succulent characteristic. The leaves are quite thick, and they have absolutely beautiful magenta flowers. And I like them also because they arc over the pathway. Richard and the other designers, Cheryl and the designers, did a great job of planting these along the pathway so they kind of arc into the pathway and soften the edges of the path. Some of these I read are able to withstand climates with almost a complete lack of rainfall, at least during the summer. Anybody have anything else to say about it?
Is this a true succulent? And would it, if so, can you propagate it just by breaking off a piece and hardening it off and sticking it in soil, do you think?
Well, so there's no such thing as a true succulent. I've come to understand. A succulent is a characteristic of plants. It's not a botanical term or a botanical classification. The succulents actually contain plants from all kinds of different genera and families and orders and everything. So one of the definitions of succulent that I read was a succulent is whatever a succulent collector collects. I have tried to propagate these from the leaves and I've never been successful, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. But maybe Cheryl has an observation there.
I wouldn't try and do it from the leaves. I would take a cutting from the stem and let it callus off and stick that.
Right, right. Okay, now another plant, going from one that's quite familiar to, I think, most of us, to one that I, again, have seen in the wild, but didn't recognize it. And I misidentified this as an Achillea, but it's not. It's Ozothamnus, or the rice flower. And interestingly, it is not in the Umbelliferae, it is in the Asteraceae. So that means, you know, that it's in the daisy family. It's a composite flower, composite plant. And it has a really nice lacy foliage here. And I read that it's used often in floral arrangements. This plant is also maybe 18 inches, 24 inches high. So it stands out nicely in the garden. And here,
Question?
Achillea, which I used to confuse this with, millefolium. This is Yarrow. Again, a very very popular plant in our neighborhoods. People use this all over. We've got several different varieties at Gamble Garden, and it's found in several different specialty gardens that we have. It's also in the Asteraceae. Let's see. I read also that in New Mexico, it is called plumajillo, which is Spanish for little feather. And that's because the leaves all look like little tiny feathers. It's got a really, really pretty, I think the combination of both the flower and the leaves makes it just great for flower arranging. So we had encountered this plant before, and I mentioned that it's called Achillea after the Greek character Achilles, who reportedly carried it into battle to treat wounds. And apparently it is it causes vasoconstriction and has been used medicinally in order to stop bleeding. So that's sort of interesting. Anything else on that? Okay, another familiar plant. This may have escaped because Clarkia or Farewell to Spring is one of those things. Now, I understand this is—
Hey, Doug, there's a comment from Mary.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is a general comment that goes across both slides and all the slides. My observation is that it seems fairly shady there in the Watershed Garden. Maybe it's just the time of day I'm there. And I wondered if you all had noticed that too. And I find it interesting that we're seeing all these beautiful flowers in the shady, kind of a shady habitat.
I think it tends to be shady in the morning, but sunny in the afternoon.
Yeah, most of the photographs that I take are in the morning when I take the dog for his walk. And he patiently sits by while I photograph the flowers. So my impression is, but for sure, that there's a lot of shade there in the morning. And Cheryl, this is an annual. Did you guys plant this or did it escape?
I believe we seeded it.
Okay. Okay. Again, I
think that's in the area. Yeah, that's in the area that's sort of where the native garden kind of blends into the Watershed Garden. So it was originally seeded as part of the native garden.
Okay. There is one clump that's kind of all by itself in the middle of the Watershed Garden, I think. Okay. We've also encountered this plant before, Carpenteria Californica, which is in the hydrangea family. It's related to the mock orange. This is a picture from our garden, and this is a picture from the web. Most of the flowers have already gone by. Whoops. A pretty plant, especially when it's in bloom. And I understand that it produces suckers and really needs to be watched really closely, or it will spread pretty quickly. And here's another plant that's interesting. You can find this plant. This is a genus native to South America, Mexico, and Western North America. You'll find this all over the seashore, plants of this genus all over the seashore. I've seen it a lot down in Pescadero, called gumweed. It's also been used by native populations to treat cough, bronchitis, asthma, and skin conditions. It's this resin, this really sticky resin, apparently, is the active ingredient. And a little known fact, which I found interesting, is that these plants can be a real problem in the eastern part of the Rockies and in Colorado. These plants sequester selenium from the soil. And there's a lot of selenium-rich soils in the central United States. And veterinarians actually have to be aware of selenium poisoning, which results in abnormal hair and hoof formation in horses and in cattle. So, anybody have any other comments about this? All right, let's see. I'm going to go through these. We have a couple more plants here. I did want to get a couple of the grasses in there because, as I said, we've been ignoring them for a while. Juncus, or the rush, California gray rush, is something you'll also see mostly in wetter areas. And because time is running out here, I did want to just point out, look at this interesting feature of these plants. The flower, I think these are the seeds by now, but the flower actually comes from the middle of the stem, the middle of the blade of grass, rather than from the tip. And that's very typical of this, this plant. This is a really pretty festuca. It goes really nicely at the edge of the pathways because it's quite low, maybe 10 inches, maybe 12 inches at a maximum. Really pretty blue-green color. And I did read that fescue pollen is a significant contributor to hay fever, which I did not know. And then this is Lamus, which is also found all throughout California and the coastal sage scrub and chaparral and the oak woodlands.
You're showing Lomandra. Is that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I am. I'm reading the wrong notes here. There's Lomandra. Right, right. A perennial herb. There are 51 species. They're all native to Australia. And that is it. So you don't need to copy these down. We can send out the list of the URLs. But I found if you really want to know more about how to create a watershed garden, this is a really nice little pamphlet, little PDF pamphlet that's quite accessible and easy to understand. Mary sent me this link, which is all kinds of actual classroom lessons for educators, and talks about all kinds of different things that you can do to educate kids about what watersheds are and how to create them. So I think what I was most struck by in doing my photography and doing the photographs for all of these is just the range of plants. And I didn't even get all of them. There are a couple of things, especially some of the grasses, but even some flowering plants that I missed. The inventory that we have is quite extensive, and I think the plantings are really interesting. It's just a really pretty and a great addition to the Gamble Garden Specialty Gardens.
Thank you, Doug. That was amazing. And I agree. It's one of my favorite places to go when I go to Gamble these days, is to go to the Watershed Garden, because it is just bursting with life. And I think one of the principles of watershed gardening is to have as much ground covered with living things as you can, so that, that whatever that long word was, of what?
Evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration, that's a good one. That, the roots are going to be going much deeper into the soil. The water is going to be able to retain and go down deeper, and the soil will be healthier. And we see that so well exemplified in the Gamble Watershed Garden. It's pretty amazing.
And it was fun to watch the the installation of this garden, because of course they had to put in serious soil amendments in order to put in a lot of organic matter. And then this path behind me here is one that's it's a gravel that will drain right into the soil. As we know, we don't want these hard surfaces like the sidewalk that's next to it. And then there's quite a lot of mulch also. It would be nice actually to have a glass box that's filled with soil amendment and mulch on top, and then the gravel, or or whatever, as a visual aid when we're doing the tours of that garden.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so Doug, what's in the future for us? Have you looked out? I know we have our Apple Zoom coming up next week. Are you looking beyond that, or does the world end then?